celebration of our culture, not of the invasion day.
I suppose it's just something to say that, you know, it's our day, you know, like, it's just a special day where everyone gets out and has a good time, you know.
Every January, at the height of their summer, Australians celebrate Australia Day. Here in the Premier City, Sydney, it's a celebration of national culture in the late 20th century. While Australia is a modern, forward-looking place, if you dig just below the surface, there's plenty to explore and see of its convict past. Australia Day actually commemorates an event more than 200 years ago, the founding of a nation by a fleet of English mariners and 700 convicts. A harsh, difficult and extraordinary time, which tells us much about the character of this modern nation and its people.
Prison!
The late 18th century was a time of massive social and political upheaval. The French had had their revolution, and America had just won its independence. The Industrial Revolution, as well as harsh property laws, had created a new underclass in Britain. In the cities, overcrowding and unemployment led to a massive crime wave. The gallows were oversubscribed and the prisons were overcrowded, but the authorities had the answer: transportation to the land that Captain Cook had stumbled across 20 years earlier. Prior to transportation, convicts were kept in rotting warships, floating prisons anchored on the River Thames and Portsmouth Harbour. As they transferred from the prison hulks to the waiting ships, most convicts were looking at sentences to transportation of 7 years, 14 years or life. The vast majority had committed petty crimes, usually theft. Over the next 80 years, 160,000 convicts would be transported to Australia. The men outnumbered women by 6 to 1, and their average age was only 26.
Before the convicts were sent to Australia, they'd be in the harbour for a couple of months on prison ships, and that is probably their last view of England, their loved ones or the families. Because they had so much time on their hands, they'd whittle away at these things, which are just ordinary pennies, and what they do, individually inscribe something as a memento which they give to their loved ones or their family. It'll be a special message, almost like the last thing, a last memorial of their life in England. So this one here's, they're quite sad. You've got, Dear Sarah, when this you see, remember me when I'm in some foreign country. And this is my favourite, this is really, I love thee till death shall take my breath. They're really quite sad. They're almost like tombstones of their life in England.
Between 1787 and 1867, transport fleets set sail from British ports with their human cargo. The voyage of 15,000 miles took up to 8 months. Australia is a vast continent, almost the size of the United States. It remains today one of the most sparsely populated places in the world. Several 100,000 of its indigenous people, the Aborigines, had lived here undisturbed for thousands of years. It was into this vast empty place at the bottom of the world that the convicts arrived. The first fleet arrived in January 1788, and the Union Jack was raised over Sydney Cove. After their gruelling passage, the convicts, as well as their military guards, began a new settlement on the rocky summits around what is now Sydney Harbour.
It must have been wild and wonderful for them.
Yeah.
Because they could see all these rocks and this whole slope was sort of covered in heavy, dense foliage. And
where we are now.
Yeah, and one of them described it as trees growing out of the heart of rocks. This all had to be carved away. There were great, huge, overhanging caverns, which had probably been used by people before. The Cadigal tribe of the Eora were probably here, watching out over the ships as they came in. It's often stated that this was a jail, but it began as a free colony and became more jail-like later. This was like they built their own town. This was the convicts' town.
It was on the land of Sydney's Aboriginal tribes that the convicts first established their new home. At first the convicts and Aborigines got on, then relations worsened. The Aboriginal culture was devastated. Even now, they have to demonstrate for their rights.
There's a lot of misunderstanding about what actually happened. When Aboriginal people saw how convicts were being treated, they felt very sorry for the convicts, and there was actually an interaction between convicts and Aboriginal people that was more underground, that the soldiers and the rest of the community sort of weren't aware of until very much later. Convicts that were actually escaping and going and living with Aboriginal groups, so there was a certain amount of an affinity between the two groups.
And it will be about respecting the rights of our people from this part of the state.
There is now an increasing interest in the convict era. One of the best sites to find out more is the former convict barracks at Sydney's Hyde Park, now a museum.
Okay, Beverly, what's this mad machine here?
Well, this is a computerised database containing the names of all the convicts that passed through Hyde Park Barracks.
So how does it work then? I tap in my second name, yeah?
Yes.
Boom, and return. And then everyone under that name will come up, yeah?
Yes, all your ancestors, all your uncles and cousins.
Pressure.
There you are, Charles, Edward.
There's hundreds of them, isn't there?
Yeah.
It shows you what ship they came on and everything.
Oh yes, they were all identified by their ship because we've got so many with the same name. We've got over 100 John Smiths in here.
Right.
So unless you say what ship they came on, you'll never find them.
I'd come under here as John Smith. It's like you've got to have a dodgy name, haven't you? What other rights do you know then?
Well, there's George Wright.
Search, find. George Wright, what did he get up to?
Well, there he is. He's a Yorkshire man. He was a coal miner, and he was put to work here as a well sinker. He was out here in the barracks yard sinking a well using explosives.
Yeah.
And as you can see, he blew himself to pieces.
Brilliant.
Convicts can be traced not just through written records, but also by identification marks, such as tattoos. Once transported, many convicts mark their bodies with symbols of protest, even provocation.
There's this double-edged kind of thing that in one sense it makes it easier for the authorities to track them, and on the other hand it gives them some kind of personal identification mark which avoids them being relegated to the role of just a number.
Strike me fair, stand firm and do your duty.
Absolute beauty. Stripped his shirt off and turned round and the flogger saw that. Because convicts were flogged in public with other convicts looking on, what was the effect of flogging a convict that had a crucifixion scene on their chest? These tattoos are the most common after initials and pictures of the convict with his wife or with his lover. And this fits into that kind of idea about, give the convict their own identity back. Because what this guy is saying is Angus Mackay government property.
Yeah.
I think if I was transported, I'd have one of those straight off. And I like it a lot.
Before Hyde Park Barracks was set up, convicts that reoffended were subject to secondary punishments. At places like Pinchgut Island in Sydney Harbour, they were chained up or marooned, living on a diet of bread and water. But as the system grew, punishments were more structured.
There was the treadmill, where prisoners who were in private assignment might be punished for doing things like being insolent to their mistress. Next in severity came flogging, which was quite acceptable in the British justice system, because it was even allowable in the Army and Navy in those days. Nobody could be flogged unless they were sentenced to flogging by a magistrate. And of course, in order to hold a flogging, you had to have a triangle. You had to have a scourger, which was paid by the government.
Scourger, do your duty!
There had to be a surgeon present at the flogging.
1,
There had to be a drummer to count the beats.
2, 3.
And oftentimes all the other prisoners were lined up to witness this as an example and teach them not to do the same offence. We have vivid descriptions of floggings, of how the blood ran at the 11th lash and the prisoner cried out and continued crying and the prisoner collapsed, and they were very cruel punishments.
In 1810, there was a new sheriff in town. He was a Scottish military leader that had experience in the colonies. His name was Lachlan Macquarie. And not only did he want to make his stamp on the governorship, he also wanted this colony to be the pride of the British Empire. The New South Wales appointment was going to be his last chance, so that meant one thing: order. Until Macquarie's arrival, the convicts wore civilian clothes, but the new regime wanted to set them apart from the increasing numbers of free settlers.
It's very clearly punishment dress, because you would have difficulty slotting into a crowd in that sort of clothing, because you've got prisoner barracks, PB marked on your thighs, and if you look down either seam of your trousers, they button.
Yeah, I noticed that. I tried to go to the toilet later and there's no flies. You have to do the side bit. Why is that?
Well, that was done so that the trousers could be unbuttoned down both sides and removed without removing leg irons. If you committed a second crime once you were in Australia, if you tried to escape, if you abused an overseer or a military guard, then frequently punishment for a secondary offence meant labour in irons. And what that meant was these were enclosed around your ankles and then riveted on. Not screwed on, not locked on, but riveted, so they couldn't be undone. You wore these for the period of your punishment, which could be up to 7 years.
Using the skills of a convicted architect, Francis Greenway, as well as the never-ending supply of convict labour, Governor Macquarie embarked on an ambitious building programme. Macquarie wanted to leave his mark on the new colony. His buildings remain landmarks in modern Sydney. The hero of Waterloo is one of the oldest convict-built pubs still in use. Money was not the common currency for years. Instead, a complex system of barter for labour and services gradually evolved. Well, this is where they spent most of their time, convicts and soldiers alike, with their mind just on one thing. Well, maybe a couple other things, but this was the main thing: drink. Jeez, what is that?
That's the brandy.
Is it? Oh,
But
so
they
what,
loved here the rum.
the rum? Is that?
Beautiful. That's the drink they have.
Yeah, is that the main drink?
The main drink. Well, actually, that was a generic word used for the alcohol brought into the port here.
Yeah.
And then they resold it then as what it really was then as the gin, the beer, other forms of alcohol. But rum was the main one, I guess.
And where, was that made here, or did it come from the boats?
Most of it then was imported here in those very early convict days. But then, of course, we started making it ourselves.
Yeah. So what other drinks apart from the rum?
One of the actually most popular drinks is actually using gin and ginger beer. We actually had 8 or so little breweries, if you like, little places where they made the ginger beer around here, and then could mix it with any other alcohol. It was pretty rough, the gin in those pretty early days. It'd send you blind. Beautiful. I'll give you a kick.
Oh, give me more than a kick. Oh, what other drinks were there?
There's another one here I've got for you. The Catherine Haynes.
Catherine Haynes.
Pretty.
Have I got to drink that as
Pretty
well?
well known one, this one.
As the colony grew, settlements expanded into Sydney's outlying regions. It's a city surrounded by dense bushland and mountain ranges, and in convict times these were almost impenetrable. As a harsher form of punishment, convicts were used on large road projects, and the most ambitious of these was the North Road. 100 miles out of the city, a section still exists at Wiseman's Ferry.
Is this like a trek, like walking place that anyone can come
Oh
on?
yes, yes. The National Parks and Wildlife Service have been restoring it and opening it for people to walk on.
Yeah, oh, that's quite a nice little walk.
Yeah.
The conditions out here must have been quite harsh for the convicts, wasn't it, in this heat?
Yeah.
How do you survive that?
Particularly in summer, you got hot, you got sunburnt, you got bitten by ants and spiders and prickled by bushes. It wasn't very comfortable.
Even worse than the back-breaking work of the sleeping quarters. Flimsy wooden caravans which were hauled along by the convicts, who had no other means of shelter.
After 12 hours hard labour on the road, chained up, this is what people had to look forward to in the evening. 20 sweaty bodies crammed in here, still in chains, no toilet. Come Ralph, you've been dying to show me what's in your sack. Let's have a look.
Okay.
Oh dear. Is it heavy?
Yes. Haven't you noticed?
Well, I offered to help. And this is the sort of thing that the convicts would use, yeah?
They would have used tools like this, but I'll show you one in a second.
So it's not just for the stonemasons and stuff, it would be for the convicts.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But surely, wouldn't they nick them and then try and escape? I mean, you could get
no.
your irons off with that sort of thing, couldn't you?
Government tools had broad arrows put on them
Right.
to show that they were government property.
Right. So this is an old one.
This is
it?
an old convict stone breaking hammer, yeah.
Right. And that's the arrow.
That's the arrow there, yeah. And there's one on each side, yeah.
Right. Oh yeah. And it would be on all the tools.
All the tools, all the bedding, all the clothing, all the furniture, all had an arrow on it like that somewhere.
Right. Why would they have the arrow on?
It came from the Sydney family. That was part of their coat of arms, and they allowed the British government to use that as the King's mark.
Right.
It's a much more simple device than having a crown on it.
I'm going to nick this.
Life in the chain gangs was too much for some convicts, and many absconded. Great legends have arisen around the escapades of these Australian outlaws, who hid in the bush outside Sydney and near settlements like Picton.
What's famous about this area around here?
Well, this was an area where some of the early bushrangers roamed around.
Oh yeah. And what bushrangers?
Yeah, bushrangers, escaped convicts.
Yeah.
Back in the 1820s, 1830s, in the early days of the colony.
Yeah. Why would they escape?
Well, many of them ran away to escape the cruelties of the convict system.
Yeah.
And they ranged around the bush, hence the term bushranger.
The most famous bushranger in the early days was Jack Donahue, who used to shelter in the caves outside Picton. Shot dead, aged 21, he was immortalised in the Ballad of Jack Donahue, which at the time was banned as a treason song.
If you will but listen, a sorrowful tale I'll tell, concerning a young hero in action lately fell. His name it was Jack Donahue, of courage and renown, who scorned to live in slavery or be humble to the crown. On the 24th of August it was his fatal day, as he and his companions were cruising the highway. He was hailed by the horse police, he stood with heart and hand. Come on, my lads, cried Donahue, we'll fight the man for man. The awful end of Donahue, the truth to you I've told, and hope that all good Christians will pray for his soul. May the holy angels guard him, likewise our heavenly King, and our Saviour dear who died for us, redeem his soul from sin.
The vast majority of convicts were assigned to free settlers and served out their sentences. But an unfortunate minority of reoffenders were sent 1,500 miles off the coast of New South Wales to an island which was the most brutal prison of the period. Its name was Norfolk Island. Nowadays, it's a beautiful and peaceful place, a popular tourist destination. But in the 18th century, the British wanted an institution that would act as a deterrent in the colony, a system that would terrify those in Britain who heard its name.
One young Irish man in the early 1830s here described 20 lashes on this island to be the equivalent of 100 elsewhere, and just prior to getting to Norfolk he'd received 300. On his time on Norfolk he used to receive almost 4,000. We see on Norfolk Island these sorts of little...
I was going to say, why is it so bad, the whipping?
The lead is in place, didn't it, merely to tear flesh off the back.
Oh, couldn't sustain that more than 20 or something with that.
Young Frayne received 100 of these before the flagellator refused to go on. Have to remove him to this hospital, where his back scabs over, and then they give him another 100 more on his own request to get it over and done with, because he'd been issued 300. Yeah. At the end of the 100 on the back, he downs his trousers and takes the other 100 on his buttocks and thighs, and then he's thrown back into a cell. The only treatment for a flogging here is when we urinate on the ground and we lie in it. I find incredible physical brutality. brutality here.
Is that because it was sort of so far away from anywhere else they couldn't keep an eye on it?
Well, Norfolk, much like today, is out of sight, out of mind. Bishop Robert Wilson of Tasmania comes to Norfolk Island as a snap inspection, and the descriptions he gives of the men behind us in the new jail are much the same as we hear out of Germany at the end of the Second World War. Men looking like living skeletons, and the skin is a yellowish colour. They've been chained and manacled to iron grates. We also, at this period of our history, we start to notice a common theme of this communal suicide. A lot of evidence isn't around, but we get the hinges of it, and even Major Anderson, the Commandant, at one stage acknowledges it. You get in a big group of men, and we draw two straws, two short straws, of course. One becomes the killer, one becomes the person to be killed. One rips a bit of iron bar into one's stomach, and the other one quite simply gets taken out of Norfolk Island to Australia, as we had no magistrate here at that time, and he is hung in Sydney.
So they'd rather draw straws and one get murdered?
Well, I think it always asks the question in all these penal establishments around the world. Men have survived enormous hardships, but here on Norfolk Island we're finding suicide is preferable.
After the reports of the brutality and the horror on Norfolk Island leaked back to Britain, the settlement was gradually closed down. Offenders were then sent to the southern tip of Tasmania, to the very bottom of the Tasman Peninsula. The peninsula is situated nearly 1,000 miles south of the Australian mainland. Then, as now, it's one of the most isolated spots on the planet. The only landmass south of here is Antarctica. As the convict ships rounded the huge basalt cliffs at Cape Pillar, they entered the pride of the colonial prison system. Easy to police and hidden away from civilization. This was Port Arthur. Prison reformers back in Britain wanted to experiment with new forms of punishment. The centrepiece of the new institution was the model prison.
This is where they were kept for 23 hours a day.
Yeah? God. That lasts about 3 hours, I reckon.
The idea was to stop people getting flogged and knocked about in corporal punishment, chains and all the rest of it. You could put people into silent rooms and break them down into good corporate citizens and make them well behaved. When the blokes came out of their cells, they put masks on their faces so they couldn't recognise each other. They were just a number, based on their self-number, and so they could only identify with that and respond to the call of the warders on that number. So in theory, the warders wouldn't know who they were either. And when they wanted to move them into the chapel or out to the exercises yards, and they clapped hand signals. There was very little verbal communication. The guards were made to wear slippers on their feet, and they had carpet running down the hallway so that to deaden all sorts of sound. And it was really sort of sensory deprivation.
Is that the only time that gives their voice?
Yeah, in the chapel, yeah, that was the only time they could sing twice a week. and communicate with each other at the same time.
Did they have a code then while they were saying?
Well, possibly. I remember reading in Britain they also used to tap on the wall, so they could communicate that way possibly as well.
Jesus, I have promised to suffer to the end. This is too spooky, huh?
The whole thing was to depersonalise and break the spirit of the person down. The other significance of this place was to break down any sort of gang action. There was also an underlying sense of threat from the working class. The French Revolution was in the background to all of this as well. So there's that fear of what became the trade union movement, really, of men working together for a common cause.
I'm Alan Briggs, a farmer. My family's lived here for 5 generations, and we claim to be descended from a convict overseer at Port Arthur. One old fella came up to me and he said, "Alan," he said, "aren't these buildings beautiful? Isn't that lovely stonework and lovely brickwork?" I looked at him and thought, "What are you on about?" And I stood back and looked at it, and he pointed out to me, that was the first time in my life I'd ever given it this look, and ever since then I could see the beauty.
Now 42 trades were practised here. You can well imagine what some of those trades would have been. It would have been carpenters, wheelwrights, tinsmiths, blacksmiths, you name it, they did it. They made all their own shoes, they made all their own clothing.
Even before Port Arthur closed down, tourists used to come here to have a gawp at the jail. When it did finally close, cottage industry sprang up, making fake whips and leg irons. Now that the climate's changed and people can't get enough of their convict past, they also can't get enough of the convict souvenirs. Woo! Get your irons, leg irons and handcuffs, all original, all made here, dating back to early 18s. Anyone want game cards before you get flogged? Yeah? Okay. You madam, yeah? You'll need it. Know what I mean? Dirty girl. They are nice lead figures of mass torture. Being separated from the mainland by an easily defended isthmus, the Tasman Peninsula was a prison within a prison. Convicts built and powered a railway which connected watchtowers and workstations on the peninsula. Although the tracks are long gone, the cuttings still lead to the timber station at Cunha. Here, many of the buildings which housed the convicts remain intact, including the mess hall where 200 men were fed daily. This is what a convict would have for their daily ration. Breakfast would be Frosties, one roll, and a bowl full of oatmeal. Water would go in that, and if there's really lucky, scrapings of meat. Boil that up and it would be like a nasty porridge. There we are. For lunch, nice big roll, goes there, and a pound of meat, like that. But in them days, it wouldn't look like this. It would be this, dried out and salted. Then for the evening meal, Just one roll, I'm afraid. And, if there was good, cup of tea. And if you was an overseer, you'd have a spoonful of sugar in that. Well, for me, it's time to make some breakfast. Well, this is the breakfast: oatmeal, water, and bits of beef. They called it skilly. By the mid-19th century, half of Tasmania's population was made up of convicts. Huge estates would get free labour in exchange for feeding and clothing their convicts. Moving from one assignment to the next, they would often be seen walking along the roads in chains, sometimes travelling from one end of the island to the other. I ran into Nick, dressed in convict clothes, and retracing the journey.
I guess I'm looking through the eyes of a convict, really.
Yeah.
I started walking last Sunday from Oaklands. For the first 2 days I covered 50 kilometres, and the pain was so great in my legs that they felt like they were rocks. And my legs actually swelled up to around about, I would have said 1/3 the size again. But my ankles actually went numb from the pain, and took my boots off, and that was the wrong thing to do. My feet swelled up. I had to put my boots back on again and continue walking. And it was agony. I actually started crying from the pain.
So are these like original leg irons then?
Yeah, in actual fact they are. A convict would have worn them. What can I say? He was a better man than me. A lot of convicts had problems with their ankles or their legs becoming ulcerated or infected, but there were certain techniques of trying to stop them from cutting in. Basically, one leg iron with a chain facing back, and the other facing forward, so that when you're taking a stride, they're not twisting like this on your leg and not lifting up your hand. When you take a step, lift the centre chain around about 1.5 inches, and it stops a lot of twisting. What they suffered back then, I guess, it really shaped Australians to what we are today. The hardship and the pain, and basically the way that they were treated, and how we continued on, why we're so strong.
Across the wild blue mountains I scour the Bathurst plains. We scorn to live in slavery, bound down by iron chains.
Like elsewhere, escape attempts in Tasmania were frequent. Even today, this island is home to some of the remotest mountains and forests in the world. Most of the amazing escape stories from the convict times came from across the ruggedly beautiful mountain ranges, which cut the west of Tasmania off from the east. An isolated settlement, which was meant to be escape-proof, was built in the middle of Macquarie Harbour. It was a natural prison known as Sarah Island. The convicts were used to cut down the massive Huon pines, which was probably the most important raw material to this colony. They'd lash the logs together and then raft them down the river, eventually ending up here in Sarah Island. They'd be working 12 hours a day in freezing cold water and in irons under the scrutiny of the evil guards. Not surprisingly, their main objective was escape. And what kind of convicts were put here?
two categories really. A lot of convicts that were escapees from other penal stations who were put in this assignment, the convicts of Australia, and a lot of skilled men who were detailed down here to build ships.
So is this the kind of terrain that the convicts had to escape through?
If they were lucky, but in many places it's much, much, much more dense than this.
Would they have their chains on if they escaped?
No, most of them would have lost their chains before they took off into the bush.
Yeah.
But some of the early escape attempts were done with either without boots or with boots that were so pathetic that they fell to pieces. So the convicts came in with bleeding feet.
Oh, I bet they did. Tell us about some exciting escapes.
My very favourite is the theft of the Cyprus, which is one of the supply vessels that was running around a mob of retransported convicts to Macquarie Harbour. And the convicts seized the vessel en route, and they put loyal convicts and some of the officers and crew on shore. And they sailed the Cyprus off to Japan. So they scuttled her and then rowed ashore and pretended to be shipwrecked British mariners. They were sent all the way back to Britain as poor starving shipwrecked sailors. And then one of them was walking down Pall Mall and whooshed to me coming the other direction, but the ex-police constable from Hobart Town recognised his tattoos. So you get a whole series of escape attempts, and basically the convicts get better and better at it. So the early ones are like blundering probes. One of the early blundering attempts involved a group of 7 convicts who tried to take a direct route through the temperate rainforest and across the mountain ranges to Hobart. Very quickly they realised that they'd miscalculated, that things had gone wrong.
They decided among themselves, they had an axe with them that they'd stolen, decided they'd kill the weakest member of the party. Well, they killed the weakest member of the party and ate him, bits and pieces. They kept on killing the weakest. The last one to go was my ancestor William Coventry. They still had his leg bone when they made it through to civilization.
Some escapees fared better. William Buckley escaped to the bush and lived for 20 years with Aborigines. When he was eventually captured, he had forgotten how to speak English. He was pardoned and ended his days as a well-respected civil servant in Hobart. Many modern-day Tasmanians are descended from convicts, and travelling around the island you'll meet them. Often they have a story to tell.
I spent a lot of time at my grandfather's place, and I wouldn't have known that this ex-convict even existed. I never heard his name mentioned once during my lifetime by the family.
It was very important to people the people who weren't convicts, to make sure that everybody knew they weren't convicts. They didn't want to be, mistaken for one of them.
It was considered a disgrace in those days. He was the underdog when he was a convict, and I was one of 2 rich people around used to, oh, you're only a bloody convict. Well, that might be so, but when you come to work it out, to be sent out for taking 4 shillings to the tobacco pouch, and what they do today, there's a lot more convicts about today than there was them days.
In the museum at Launceston in Tasmania, you can still see the flag of the Anti-Transportation League. In 1868, they put an end to transportation, and then a similar flag flew over the whole nation. 200 years on, the Australian flag still retains a permanent reminder of the country's convict past.
Your name upon my backbone, stretch my skin upon a drum, iron me up on Pinch Gut Island from now till kingdom come. I will eat your Norfolk dumpling like a juicy Spanish plum, even dance the Newgate hornpipe, if you'll only give me rum.